Does it work? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So, yeah, again, we come back to this bioeconomy and SDG question. Sorry. It will complement in a way Uwe's presentation, because you'll see it's a completely different approach, more macro, and the fundamental question here was to see in what extent the European Commission strategy for the bioeconomy can contribute and align to the SDGs. So we are again in this question, we have a lot of different frameworks, strategies, etc., but how can we interpret this big puzzle, and can we align some things? Very briefly, I'm Tevecia Ronzon. I work at JRC, which is the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and you have to see it as an in-house scientific service for the European Commission. So our work is always focused on policy question, and we try to give the scientific answer. Finally, of course, policymakers take our information, but they have other political arguments at the time of taking their decision, but we try just to contribute to their decision. The study I will present today has been done at the level of the European Union, because it was for the European Commission, but I have extracted data for France in order to give a bit of insight on the French case. The study proceeds in 2 steps. First step is to define the scope of the bioeconomy within the SDG and to answer the first research question. To which SDG or to which sustainable development dimension does the current bioeconomy strategy, the European one, contributes to? We could do exactly the same by taking the French bioeconomy strategy. I did not, because my audience was the European Commission. But I guess we would find more or less the same results, because finally the objective is the same, and it would not change too much. And the second research question, once we know how does the bioeconomy strategy aligns with the SDG, are there some areas where we can find synergies and trade-offs? Synergies in the sense that if we implement policy actions that improves that progress towards one given SDG or one given SDG target, it is associated to progress towards another. And trade-offs would be the contrary. We try to tackle one SDG, but it is correlated with deterioration of another, and we have to be aware of it. I think Uwe already gave a nice introduction to this inter-linkages reflection. So research question 1, I will be brief because second part maybe is worth more discussion. How did we map the European bioeconomy strategy with the SDG framework? We took the action plan that we consider the operational form. It's not only blah blah, it's a list of different actions that the European Commission promotes. And we mapped each action with one or several SDG targets. Very simple example, in the European bioeconomy strategies, there is one action that is towards the promotion of public-private partnerships in order to raise investments in bioeconomy field. It relates exactly with SDG 17, with partnerships for the goal, and one specific SDG 17 target, which is about public-private partnerships. So we made this semantic mapping for each of the SDG targets, and we found that the action plan, as it is foreseen, then it's too early to say if it has achieved the objective, but as the action plan is foreseen, it will contribute to reaching 53 SDG targets distributed within 12 SDGs. So you will see here there's a slight difference between Uwe's presentation, because I stick to the European bioeconomy strategy, and the difference with Uwe, for example, is that there is no action that directly tackled health dimension, for example. So SDG 6, if I remember, because I cannot see very well, is not included in my scope. I have also excluded peace and justice and gender equality. I think on this we align, because they are not addressed by bioeconomy strategy. And then there is, we can discuss if no poverty and reduce inequality should be in or not. We have considered that they were not directly targeted by the action plan, so it could be an indirect consequence of the implementation of the strategy, but we were cautious and excluded it as a direct contribution. After we have mapped the strategy with the SDG targets, we used the official framework. The UN have defined a list of SDG indicators that relates to each of the targets, and one single target can be measured with different indicators. So we took all the indicators related to the target we had identified as bioeconomy related, and we complemented also with Eurostat SDG indicators for those targets, and we ended up with a very broad list of bioeconomy related SDG indicators following the official framework. For sure, those indicators are measured at national level. They were not designed for the bioeconomy purpose, so we can discuss the granularity of the information they provide, but this exercise was very exploratory. If we try to align the different frameworks and we keep the same perspective, what does it tell us? The indicators found, so as I said, initially we had like a 200 plus list of indicators that we reduced by removing those that were not really relevant for the bioeconomy because SDGs were broader. We removed those that were duplicated because they are measured with several units and we didn't want to duplicate the information. For example, an indicator measured for male, female, and total. We kept only total. And we removed also those that were not informed with enough data, and we ended up with only, 53 indicators, the same as the number of targets, but it's by chance. Indicators are very unevenly distributed across SDG. Actually, SDG 17 is not then included in the study because there were no indicators on these bioeconomy-related targets, and some are overrepresented compared to the rest. Okay, so now the synergies and trade-off. Our approach here was to remove as much as we could subjectivity, and we said, okay, we will go for a correlation analysis as already presented in a study in Earth Futures from Prada Metal. I should have wrote their name because they were the real source of inspiration. And we tried to look for each indicator pair. Here, here, for example, for the indicators that inform SDG 9 and those that inform SDG 14, if we found a positive correlation, that would mean a synergy, or a negative one that would highlight a trade-off or a conflict. Quickly, I will not enter into technical details. What we've done is to run this correlation analysis for each possible pair of indicators we had identified as bioeconomy related, and we classified the significant correlation as synergy if the coefficient of correlation was positive and higher than 0.6, as a trade-off if it was positive and lower than minus 0.6, and in between not classified, we drew no conclusion. We did this correlation analysis at the member state level, so we ended up with 28 correlation matrices. France is one of them. And as initially the idea was to look at the European picture, we also aggregated the result at the EU level by calculating for each indicator pair the proportion of significant, synergies or significant trade-offs found across the 28 member states. So here the color code is the darker, the higher the proportion of synergy if it is in green, or trade-off if it is in red. And we made a second level of aggregation because our policymakers wanted very short messages. At the SDG level, if we count the proportion of SDGs, for example, I will take the example, SDG 2 is about agriculture, and he's measured with several indicators on agrobiodiversity, on nitrogen or phosphorus balances, etc., etc. We calculated here, among all those pairs of indicators that belong to SDG 2, what was the proportion of synergies and trade-off. So this would be a result at intra-SDG level, and the other ones at inter-SDG level. Here would be SDG 2 indicators with SDG 4. Well, in fact, what you have to remind is that the green would mean synergy, and orange or red a trade-off. And sorry, before the results, it's one slide on limitations because it's important. Our approach was indeed to use only official information. So we were very dependent on the data that were available in the United Nations and Eurostat databases and their quality. So it has influenced the results. I've already mentioned, for example, SDG 17 is not included in the correlation analysis because we had no data. Also, SDG indicators are measured at national level, and we are not able to capture extra-national effects. For example, extra-national effect of the consumption of biomass, which is in fact an important point. I've already presented this study elsewhere, and people were sometimes a bit disappointed that it does not capture what's really going on in bio-based value chains. Again, this is a limitation of this approach, that we want to explore what we can conclude from using official frameworks. And last limitation, it is all about a correlation analysis. There is no cause-effect conclusion. We just know that one given SDG indicator is correlated with another one. We don't know which one of the two influence the other, or if it is a two-way correlation. Having said that, as a result, you can see that at the highest aggregated level, the green color predominates. We have found a higher proportion of synergies across the 28 member states for 59 pairs of indicators over 63, so it's a vast majority. It is a good news, meaning that most probably when we implement an action towards one given SDG, it will be correlated with progress towards another. If we summarize the results in a way by doing a top 10 ranking, on the left-hand side, I've ranked the SDG pairs according to the proportion of synergy found. First one would be SDG 7 on clean energies with SDG 13 on climate action, and then the proportion of synergies decreases. On the right-hand side is exactly the contrary, with trade-off, highest trade-off with SDG 14 and SDG 12, and then a lower proportion of trade-off. On trade-off, I have to stress that it is indeed a ranking, but in fact, even though SDG 14 and SDG 12 show the highest proportion of trade-offs, for example, in fact, there are more synergies than trade-off. It's less than 50%. So it's also helped to balance the picture. Very broad conclusion that we can draw from these top 10 SDG per lists. You can see for the synergies that SDG 7, SDG 11, sorry, I should say maybe to what they correspond. SDG 7 on clean energy, 11 in the study, it was represented by only one indicator, the recycling rate in municipalities, and SDG 15 are the one more represented. 15 is for terrestrial ecosystems. So synergies are maybe more concentrated towards a few SDGs, while trade-off show higher diversities of SDGs involved. Well, among the main SDGs represented, or most represented in this list, are SDG 2 on agricultural development, SDG 9 on industrial development, and SDG 8 and 12. They both share the same indicators of domestic material consumption. And I will just complete with this picture. So it was I showed you before the picture at the SDG level. Then we can go deeper and see where exactly are the synergies and trade-offs if we go at the level of the indicator. For the synergies, this is the EU picture. Synergies are spread all over the indicator pairs. You have to imagine that you have all the bioeconomy related SDG indicators in rows and columns, and each cell represents a pair of indicators. Below the diagonal, I have put the synergies and above the trade-offs. So synergies are really spread all over the place, while trade-offs are concentrated in some very specific indicators that I have colored with colored frame here. One specific hotspot of trade-off is related with two specific SDG2 indicators, agrobiodiversity at risk, and the agricultural orientation index of government expenditures. That means that, in fact, most of the time, when you improve many different SDGs represented in columns, there is no progress towards agrobiodiversity at the same time. Second hotspot of trade-offs about the industry, the industrial development, in fact, the development of value-added and jobs in manufacturing sectors. And I will come back to those results after. And the last hotspot of trade-off, this one that is shared between SDG 8 and 12, on biomass material consumption, and in particular of wood and crop residues. Okay, so now if we compare with France, again, synergies are quite well spread among the different indicator pairs. And again, we have some very specific hotspots of trade-offs. Some are shared with the European picture. In fact, it was the manufacturing, jobs and value added in the manufacturing sectors are identified as a trade-off both in France, yes, I think in France and in Europe. And we can see two new hotspots of trade-offs appearing on the French picture, and they both relate with employment. SDG 4 on the employment of recent graduates, and SDG, I don't remember the number, the long-term unemployment rate. So we can see here that the challenges differ quite a bit between EU and France. And what are the conclusions we can give to policymakers? First, if we look at the common features between the Europe and France, synergies dominates over trade-offs, and they are distributed all over the different indicator pairs. So this means that if you introduce a measure that will comfort one SDG indicator, there's a good chance that you will bring co-benefits with this measure. The other way around, if you withdraw a measure that already exists and permits to achieve good results toward one SDG indicator, be careful. It is not a cause-effect analysis, but it could be associated with the deterioration of many other performance towards the SDGs. Also, other common feature, the fact that industrial development seems not to be aligned with the rest of the SDGs. In fact, this is exactly the challenge of the bioeconomy strategy, finding a way to decouple the negative impact of industrial development with other social or environmental indicators. So far, the European Bioeconomy Strategy proposes to promote technical and technological innovations to go towards this decoupling and to integrate more the circularity into industrial processes. But it's certainly not the only options on the table. Now, if we look at the differences between the two pictures, some trade-offs were specific to the EU. Agricultural development was not always aligned with the rest of the SDG targets, and the consumption of woody biomass and crop residues. I put here, is it a strength of France not to have those trade-offs on the picture? I will not conclude today because I should go deeper in the data and to look if what was the cause of those trade-offs not appearing. Maybe there were not enough data, or maybe other thing that, something else, that not having a trade-off at all. Well, those two trade-offs calls again for change in practices, innovations, etc. But this one calls for maybe the most challenging action, which is the change in our consumption behavior. Now, the trade-off specific to France, we could question if it is a weakness of France. Most of the other European member states don't show those trade-offs. They are all related with employment and the ability to decouple our economic sectors with bad performance towards the rest of the SDGs. Again, this is very preliminary conclusion. Then you have to go into the data and to start a deeper analysis. But this is what really comes first when you look at this correlation analysis. And with that, I will thank you for your attention. I have to do this disclaimer that it was my own work and my own interpretation of the result, but it does not reflect the official position of the European Commission. Any question you have, I will be happy to answer them today, or you can also contact myself and my co-author for this study from the Aragonese Research Center in Spain.
No, maybe
we do not meet enough in the corridors, apparently.
Thank you, Tevecia, for the presentation. I didn't get how many of those indicators are quantitative based and how many are qualitative?
They are all quantitative. It is a quantitative database. There are two, in fact, the UN one and the Eurostat one, and it refers to time series from 1990 to 2018. So yeah, I should have stressed that this is an ex-post analysis. So those trade-offs are not meant to continue in the future. It is exactly where maybe we can take action in order to avoid them in the future. The same message as Uwe's message.
Thank you. Very short, Uwe. I know, at least for the Eurostat data, I don't know much about the French, but in the Eurostat data, the farther you go back, the larger is the uncertainty. And that means the range where you actually don't know where the data point is. And because there was a lot of estimates in the early 90s. Is it something you can reflect? So what is the robustness of what you found? I mean, that's basically the question I think a lot of people would like to hear the answer.
Yeah, tricky question. I don't know exactly what's the robustness of the data, and I'm not sure Eurostat reports on the uncertainty associated to their data. What is certainly sure is that it was a first screening analysis using official data, but we could go deeper into the bioeconomy sectors by using non-official data and more that reflect more precisely what's going on in agriculture or in biomass producing sectors, in industrial sectors, in bioenergy sectors. And maybe this could address this robustness weakness, let's say. And yeah, and you said you are not sure about the status of French data. I used also Eurostat data for France. I mean, all is done with by using Eurostat and UN data.
if I understand correctly, we looked at the correlation based on statistical data. Have you also looked into cause effect?
Well, what is not presented here is all the discussion section, when in fact we look at what are the actual measures, policy measures that already that already strengthens the synergies and those that are in place to avoid trade-offs, and apparently they are not always performant enough. And by doing this, yes, of course, for example, if you take the Natura 2000 initiative, the very rationale of this initiative is that by protecting certain area, you will also achieve progress towards biodiversity. So this is a kind of cause-effect recognition. So in the discussion section, we list all those cause-effect relations we could find that are already tackled by policy instruments. And indeed, in fact, if it's of your interest, we found that there are many policies in place already tackling those synergies, pairs of relation. And there are some tackling trade-offs, which is kind of a bit of pessimistic results, because apparently some are in place, but trade-offs are still there. So we need a new set of action, maybe. Or maybe what we need is not only policy measures, but individual responsibility and maybe something else. They are hungry, maybe it's lunchtime and okay.